So in this third chapter of part 5 of our book Traditions and Encounters, we are focusing on the new worlds, the Americas and Oceania. The chapter focuses on the impact of Europeans on the new worlds that were now accessible, including Americas and Oceania, even though we are not going to focus too much on Oceania. So there are several aspects to this. There is the aspect of conquest, and then the aspect of the new societies that form themselves. And at this point we have the map, the first map of this chapter, which is a map of the Americas around the year 1700. What we observe is that the majority of the territory is now dominated by some European power. So we can see from the beginning that in the territories of the America, the style of colonial domination is modeled on conquest and domination of the territory rather than the trading post type of empire. In particular, we want to notice that, for example, the Portuguese have the colony of Brazil. Spain, the Crown of Spain, has all the colonies on the west, on the Pacific coast of the Americas, and many colonies in the archipelago of the Antilles. France has colonized the central part of North America. And England only has a few colonies on the east coast of what today is the United States, and the Netherlands have a colony in the territory of Guyana near north of Brazil. How do we explain, for example, that Portugal has kept the colony of Brazil but has not expanded westward like the Spaniards have? Well, we have to remember that just 2 years after the first arrival of Europeans in the New World, we have the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494 was between the Crown of Portugal and the Crown of Spain. And at that time, nobody had the foggiest idea of how large the Americas would turn out to be. So the Portuguese settled for access to colonizing the east part of South America, okay, and traded that for non-interference with the Spaniards if they would colonize everything that is west of a certain meridian of the earth. Okay, so we see that as a result of that treaty, the Spaniards had no competition in colonizing all the west, the Pacific rim of the Americas, and then they also kept their colonies in Central America. So this chapter helps us to understand what was the experience of this domination for the indigenous people of this continent and also for the continent itself. What were the factors that made this domination possible, and what new societies were formed? Okay. When we consider this, we have to understand that Europeans came with a predatory mentality. They came with a sense of scarcity and perceived need for domination and accumulation. They could not understand the sense of abundance the indigenous populations had, their way to live in the moment, and trust in the universe that abundance would be brought of whatever they might need in the moment. This was especially true of the inhabitants of the Caribbean, especially the Taínos, and also for the natives of North America. For example, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche. They were hunters and gatherers. So they grazed on a territory, they harvested whatever they could eat from natural production, and they hunted whatever they could need. And when they felt that the territory was a bit depleted, they would move to the next area, and so on and so forth, until they might come back to the same territory. So this lifestyle did not allow for a lot of accumulation or a lot of excessive growth. They couldn't have a whole lot of babies, and they couldn't carry a lot of stuff. So they lived in the moment, and they felt that when an area was a little depleted, it would be easier to hunt nearby. So that area had an opportunity to regrow itself, its flora, its fauna, and so on. So it was a very sustainable way to be organized as a society. The Taínos, we can say even more, because the Taínos lived in the islands of the Caribbean that were marvelous in their abundance. With a tropical climate, there never was a non-growing season. There never was a day when it was cold enough that you couldn't harvest anything, that would be no fruits on the trees that you could eat. So they were accustomed to this bounty of nature and to living in the moment. So not only the Europeans, so the Europeans came with this predatory mentality, and in their mind, anything that was valuable was something that could be accumulated and stored, and then that involved, of course, domination, because people are not happy to give you something that they're using at the moment. But not only they had no respect for these people who lived in this very sustainable way in communion with nature, but they had no respect either for the complex societies of the Americas. There were two complex societies in the Americas at this time: the Aztecs, who lived in Mexico, and the Incas, who lived in Peru, or what today is Mexico and what today is Peru. The Aztecs were conquered and destroyed by Cortez, and the Incas were conquered and destroyed by Pizarro. Those were the two major conquistadors of Spain that destroyed these complex societies of the Americas. How did this domination came to be? Clearly, the Europeans had superior weapons. They had firearms that were made of steel and that used gunpowder. So that was a very important factor. Another factor is the belief system that they had. Not only did they have this sense of scarcity and desire for accumulation and domination, but they also believed that all the natural resources, all the creatures and the species, and even the people that were not European, had been placed on earth for their own benefit. That's the idea that in a way comes from the scripture, scripture that says that man is made in God's image, so man or humans are the species that most resembles the divine, and so everything else is really made for them. So they had this illusion, they had this understanding. We have to understand that there really was nothing superior or special about them, that they were not better in any absolute sense, but simply that they had the weapons that enabled them to dominate, and they had the belief systems that did not enable them to understand what they found, to appreciate it for what it was. And in fact, one of the recent books by a scholar named Jared Diamond is entitled Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it is really about this point, that there was nothing superior to the Europeans, simply that they had guns, they had germs, and they had steel. And let's see these three elements in action. We have seen germs in action when the population of the Caribbean was decimated by smallpox, went from 4 million to 30,000 in about 40 years. Besides, of course, the decimation due to attempted enslavement and actual direct extermination. But then we have guns and steel. Of course, firearms are made of steel, and they use powder, and they have a much larger range than the arrows of the Indian chiefs. So what happened to the populations of North America? They were estimated at 5 to 10 million before the arrival of the Europeans, and they were down to 600,000 in the year 1800. It was more displacement. And what happens to the populations of hunters and gatherers when they are displaced from, say, from a more fertile region, more humid region to a more arid region? These are populations that live, whose knowledge is based on their knowledge of the territory. They know what herbs will do this, they know where to find this animal, this other animal, they know when this harvest will be ready and when it won't. So they have a lot of situated knowledge within the environment that has been accumulated over the centuries, where they have occupied this environment, moving around in a certain narrow range. When they become displaced from, say, a very cold climate like the Midwest to the Southwest, to a much warmer climate, much more arid soil, all this knowledge is lost, is inapplicable. And so they lose their knowledge, they become displaced, and they become even more vulnerable to the attacks with guns and steel. And this happened to many of the tribes that existed in North America, including the Apache, the Sioux, the Comanches, the Cheyenne, and many others. So what kinds of societies were formed eventually? Clearly these were societies that had very deep scars within themselves that came from these very recent conflicts. And at the same time, there were societies that became hybrid because clearly people were now on the same territory, and so in one way or another they intermingled. Particularly, we are going to look at two styles of colonization, the Spanish style in the Spanish colonies and the English style in the English colonies. We have to remember that the conquistadors who came from Spain, like, say, Cortez or Pizarro, they came alone. They were adventurers, often with some sponsorship from the crown, or maybe also self-sponsored, who came to gather riches and become powerful. And they didn't come with their wives. They came alone. They were male, and they came alone. So that, of course, was an incentive for the hybridization, because eventually they ended up having sex with someone on the new lands. And so we have three categories of people that were typical of these multicultural societies, especially in the Spanish colonies. The mestizos were people who had Spanish ancestry and indigenous ancestry. The mulattoes were people who had Spanish ancestry and African ancestry. And the Zambu were people with African and indigenous ancestries. Also, these societies became organized around, again, who was more originally from Spain. And so there were the peninsulares and the criollos. The peninsulares were the people who came directly to the colonies from Spain, and the criollos were the ones who had been in the colonies already for a few generations and were a little more hybridized. So we see that in a way the arrival of the conquistadors again sets the stage for a type of colonization that involves a lot of hybridization, a lot of mestization, as it is called. The type of administration that typified the Spanish colony was the central authority of the viceroy. Okay, this viceroy replaced the king, was the central authority of the colony, and replaced the king. The viceroy was directly connected with the hacendados, the families that had a hacienda, namely they had a territory, a plantation that they administered, that they run. And that had also an encomienda, namely they had a commitment to the viceroy to produce so much of this and so much of that. So these were the privileged classes directly connected with the viceroy through their management of a hacienda. The Spanish colonization was characterized by an emphasis on non-renewable action. For example, we have to remember that for the people of the Americas, the indigenous people of the Americas, silver or gold really had no special value. They didn't attribute special value to these metals, but the Europeans did, and so they wanted to find all the gold and all the silver that there was on the continent continent, and they did so through mining. For example, a famous mine of Potosi in the tip of South America, which was a silver mine. So it is obviously mining is non-renewable, because when you've mined all the gold that there is, there's nothing else to do. So they really devoted themselves to these non-renewable activities. There were occasions when the crown would protect the indigenous population against some particularly rapacious colonists. So there was some recourse, but it all went back to the same central authority. The English colonies were quite different. There was less mestization, less hybridization, and partly that had to do with the beginning. Who arrived in the 13 colonies of the east coast of the United States? Mainly pilgrims, people who were religious dissenters from the popular classes of England, and came with their wives. The whole family immigrated to the colony in the United States. And particularly we remember the Puritans. So there was much less incentive to hybridize, because these colonists, sort of religious dissenters, came with their own families. Nonetheless, in both styles of colonization, the practice that eventually prevailed was that of sourcing agricultural laborers from Africa through the slave trade that deported young individuals from especially West Africa, and then put them in the ships, in the cargo ships, that then delivered them to the plantations as slaves. So it doesn't matter if it was a Spanish or English colonies, when there was a plantation, the labor was always the unpaid labor of deported African slaves. In the northern part of North America, areas around Canada, there was another trade, the fur trade. There were many fur animals like beavers, for example. And those who worked in those trades were often indentured laborers, people who were too poor to pay for their passage, so they would sell their labor after their arrival in exchange for the passage. And then eventually, when that was paid off, they could be freed. And they did exterminate the population of the fur animals up there. In the area of religions, we see a lot of, initially we see a lot of forced conversions. Forced conversions that, sometimes the survival of indigenous groups was based on, predicated on their conversion, which we can't imagine to be extremely genuine, since their life could depend on it. So there was this idea that the Christians had that if they could only convert these savages to Christianity, they would save them. And often they proceeded to exterminate them right after they had converted them, because they were saved anyway. In fact, there was a chief in Puerto Rico, Atway, and because often in these colonial ships there were the conquistadors, and then there were also the chaplains, the priests, right? And Bartolomeo de las Casas was one of them, and he wrote everything about this first voyage to the island of Puerto Rico. And so one of the stories he tells is that this Taino chief Atway was tortured, and then he was called as a chaplain to save his soul and convert him to Christianity, so the conquistadors could kill him. And then Atway was not too convinced that he wanted to convert, and then he asked the question, but where are the Christians going? Are they going to paradise or hell? And he was told, well, the Christians go to paradise. He says, oh, I want to go to hell. So, that's a bit of an anecdote about these conversions that, were not what you would call exactly genuine. And then eventually there was integrations of religious symbols and practices. For example, the Virgin of Guadalupe is a virgin with a skin tone that is relatively hybrid and so reflects the hybridity of the New World. And then there are religious practices that come from Afro-American spirituality, like voodoo, that in itself comes from West African spiritualities. So we are now coming to the fourth chapter of part 5 of our book, Traditions and Encounters. Part 5, which focuses on the age of global interdependence, and chapter 4 focuses on the continent of Africa. Its title is Africa and the Atlantic World. So this chapter is dedicated to what happened to Africa and the African people as a result of the Columbian exchange. The central trope of the chapter is, of course, the slave trade and the slave labor to which deported Africans were subjected. Also important is looking at the consequences of the trade in Africa itself, among the populations of Africa and on the African continent. Finally, we will look at how the trade and slavery itself eventually were abolished. Okay, so we look first at the first map of this chapter, and we see the continent of Africa, and we see 3 complex societies in it: the Songhai Kingdom, the Kingdom of Congo, and the Karen-Borno Kingdom. So these were independent kingdoms, and they were also the most important complex societies of Africa at this time. There were also many cities on the Indian Ocean, and those were rather advanced and flourishing cities. We also have to consider that the situation of Africa was a significant factor in that was the influence of Islam. Especially in East Africa, Islam had become very influential, as it had in North Africa as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, namely the part of Africa that is under the desert of Sahara, Islam was often imported, and it was used as often as a way to contain the behavior of African women. For example, the women of the West African tribes that went bare-breasted, or that were accustomed to speaking with people liberally, even as married women. So in Africa as well, the arrival of American crops favored a population growth, especially maize or corn and peanuts. We also have to look at the practice of slavery within Africa before the Atlantic slave trade even started. We have to understand the cultures of these regions, especially West Africa, and the idea that they had that there was no individual land ownership. In other words, they didn't believe, as we do, that a piece of the earth could belong to someone. They believed in the sovereignty of the earth, and therefore nobody could actually appropriate a little parcel of it. I think it was a very wise belief, because indeed we cannot own any parts of the earth for real. Anytime we could have a hurricane or an earthquake, and our little parcel, our little land property would disappear. It's a good reminder to know that some of the cultures of our planet had this notion that individual land ownership is just a delusion. And the societies were organized by tribes. A tribe was associated with the territory, and rather than owning the territory, the tribe believed that that its mission was to take care of this territory and to steward it. So if a tribe grew, it would have more people and therefore more territory. And obviously there was an incentive for a tribe to grow, because then it would also expand the territory that it could use for its own needs. So what happened sometimes was that a person would be stranded between tribes. Maybe somebody had been expelled by a tribe, or had lost his or her way back to his or her tribe. So these people who were stranded between tribes, they would perhaps arrive at a new tribe, at the territory of a new tribe, and they were welcomed as slaves. So slavery was a temporary state. In fact, they were welcomed as part of the family, but in this temporary state of being slaves before they would be fully integrated in the tribe. So the practice of slavery within Africa was actually a way to welcome and integrate new people in a tribe. And it changed dramatically when the Atlantic slave trade grew tremendously. There was also a very minor slave trade between the cities of the African cities on the Indian Ocean and India. That pre-existed the Atlantic slave trade, but it never really grew to the point of aberration that the Atlantic slave trade did grow to. And so we come to map 2 of this chapter, where we see the famous triangular trade, the triangular trade. So we talk about the slave trade, and we see that it really has a triangular shape. What is this? What are the three sides of the triangle here? Well, the side from the American colonies of the southern United States, of the Caribbean, and of the coast of Brazil, we have shipments of crops, cash crops grown in the New World that are then shipped back to Europe. These include sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton. So the ships go full of merchandises back to Europe of these products of plantation agriculture. Then when they travel from the sort of vertical side of the triangle, when they travel from Europe to Africa, they usually are full of manufactured goods. Many of these goods are weapons. They are the arms that the slave traders and the captors are going to use to actually chain the people of Africa and then ship them off. So then the final angle of the trade is the trade from Africa to the plantations, and this is called, for the people of Africa who were deported during this period of this Atlantic slave trade, this is known as the dreaded Middle Passage, the Middle Passage. We have to remember that people who were captured were kept in the fortresses on the coast of West Africa, and then eventually shipped off as cargo on the ships that took them away. And so this passage was by no means any pleasant experience. It was an experience that many did not survive. In fact, the estimate is that about 12 million people from Africa arrived to the coasts of the New World during the period of the Atlantic slave trade, which peaked in the 18th century. It is also estimated that about 4 million of those deported people died in the passage. So, in fact, Africa did lose about 16 million people. And once then we get to the and also very important to remember is that the captors captured typically 2 men for every woman, and they captured people between 14 and 35 years of age. So they didn't capture little kids, they didn't capture your abuelita, your grandmother, but they did capture all the strong labor force of those lands, therefore leaving not only the balance of male and female off, but also the lands depleted of the most significant people in terms of labor. There were also different styles of slavery. In Brazil, for example, the planters preferred to import new slaves rather than breed new slaves. So often a person from Africa who was deported and came to Brazil as a slave didn't even live long enough or well enough to be able to reproduce. Many did, however, reproduce through the process of mestization. So, for example, they would accidentally have children with people either from Portugal or with indigenous people. In the Confederate States of the United States, the Union, the southern states that practiced slavery, it was different. In fact, those planters supported the reproduction of slaves. So they encouraged slaves to breed a new generation of slaves so that then eventually the slave population could grow and they could all be better exploited. So in those states, in fact, more segregation was practiced because the slaves were supposed to reproduce with other slaves. However, of course, a slave woman was the personal property of a slave owner, so a rape often happened, and the children that were born to this form of intercourse were also born slave. So clearly nobody likes to be enslaved, and we have to imagine these slaves always planning revolts and often being successful in mounting revolutions. So, for example, in the island just next door to us, we are in western Puerto Rico, and so if we cross the Mona Passage here, we arrive at the island of Hispaniola, also known as Haiti, especially in the French language. At one point in the late 18th century, the population was 90% black slaves, most of whom were freshly imported, in other words, were born in Africa. And there was a small percentage of the population of Creoles, namely people who had gone, planters who lived there and had lived on the island for a few generations. So during the French Revolution that, as we will learn soon, started in 1789 in France and revolutionized all of Europe, the Creoles were the first ones to sort of conspire and revolt against France. But the reality was that the slaves were the vast majority of the population, and eventually when they rebelled, they took over. So eventually in 1804, the first black republic of the New World was founded. The slaves were successful in their revolution, and so they established the first republic of the New World that had no slavery. However, this country was, this early independent country was not supported. There was no nation in the world had an interest in supporting its independence, and it was also heavily penalized by other nations and by France itself. France exacted a compensation for the loss of the plantations of Haiti until 1947 from the government of Haiti, something almost hard to believe. We have to consider that slavery is not the best way to obtain good labor from people. If you pay them a salary, they may work a little better. And that, of course, slavery is a form of forced labor. It is natural for people to rebel to slavery. So there is a social cost to slavery, and that cost is the continuous surveillance. Even though the life of the people deported from Africa, the Middle Passage, and the lives in the plantations of these people who were reduced to property that their owners could do anything they wanted with, including selling them, whipping them, torturing them, making them work perforce. There were many Afro-American traditions that developed even during the period of slavery. There were two languages, for example, that formed in the process of the slave trade. They are known as Gula and Geechee, and they are Creoles that were spoken in certain plantations. There were also religious practices that were devoted, that evolved, because the slaves, of course, had their own religious practices, their own forms of worship coming from West Africa. Many forms of animism existed there, namely the idea that the natural elements are a form of the divine, the sanctity of a tree, for example, etc. So these mingled with the religious practices of Christianity. They were often imposed to slaves to form new hybrid traditions. So we remember Santeria, practiced in Cuba, Voodoo, practiced in Haiti, and then Candomblé, practiced in Brazil. The end of slavery was a result of the revolts and the organization of many slave leaders and also of social reformers. Also, it was an effect of the decline of plantation economy and the rise of industrialism. So first came the abolition of the trade, and then came the abolition of actual slavery. So in Denmark abolished the trade in 1803. Great Britain abolished the trade in 1807. In the US, it was 1808. In France, it was 1814. In the Netherlands, it was 1817. And in Spain, it was 1845, finally. As to slavery itself, it was abolished in the British colonies in 1833. In the French colonies in 1848, and then in the US, the Confederate States that practiced slavery and had prominent plantation economies at that time, slavery was abolished as an effect of the Civil War in 1865, and in Cuba it was abolished in 1886, and then in Brazil it was abolished in 1888. As a local note, we can remember that after the Haitian Revolution was successful in the 19th century, Haiti was no longer available for plantation economies. The planters had to move, and they moved to the next island, which was Cuba. So that in a way, Cuba in the 19th century, Cuba became the plantation island of the Caribbean, since Puerto Rico never really could lend itself very well to a plantation economy due to his hilly nature, the fact that there are no big plains on this island. So Cuba was really an important resource for planters, for plantation economies all along the 19th century, and then eventually had its own revolution. So we are coming to the fifth chapter of this fifth part of the volume, Traditions and Encounters, the second volume. The focus will be what happens in the era of global interdependence in China and in Japan. Okay, so first, in relation to China, we are going to look at the political transformation. And here we will have map 1 for this chapter. Okay. One of the dynasties that comes to power is the Ming dynasty. This dynasty is from China proper, and they are very active building the Great Wall, which is a defense against the populations of Manchuria and also Mongolia, and also the Grand Canal, which unites the Yellow River and the Yangtze, and therefore facilitates all kinds of communications and commerce. So they're a fairly active dynasty, and we see that China at this time has not expanded a whole lot. It's just China proper. Eventually the Qing dynasty comes, and this dynasty is original from Manchuria, which is the territory northeast of China. So here we see on map 2 for this chapter that this dynasty really expands the boundaries of China to include all of Manchuria and also most of Mongolia. So we observe an expansion of China and a sort of unification of that whole region under the Qing dynasty. In this system, this dynastic system made of emperors and their dynasties, the emperor is seen as a son of heaven. So it's seen almost as a deity, not exactly as a deity, but almost the son of heaven. How is the administration organized? There is the figure of the scholar bureaucrat. Who are the scholar bureaucrats? They are people who come from the privileged classes and can afford to devote their entire life to education, and can dedicate themselves to this education from a very early age. We have to understand that the script of China is something that requires a lot of energy for somebody to learn, because every word has an ideogram. So every word has a different sign. It's an ideographic script. So for every word that you learn in the language, you have to learn an ideogram. It's not like an alphabetic system, a script where you learn 26 letters and then all the words are made from those letters. So clearly learning in a deep way the culture and the traditions and the language and the written traditions of China requires a lot of investment in one's education, and only the privileged people were able to do it. There was a very strict system of examinations to become a scholar bureaucrat. So in a way, these scholar bureaucrats were administrators. They were rather faithful to the emperor. The emperor, in a way, had invested a lot in their education, and then they were faithful to his desires. They were his allies. There are many social and cultural traditions in China at this period, and also some change. We have to remember that the male line of descent privileges the eldest son in all families, and that the Chinese believe in the obligation of filial piety. In other words, that the children really have the obligation of taking care of the parents. So the eldest son is privileged. Not only that sons are privileged, but the eldest one is the privileged one. There is also this idea that girls are a bad investment because they don't have options. There are no options open to them in society, and therefore having too many girls, too many daughters is really is a liability of some sort. And the practice of infanticide begins even at that time against female infants. Another way to control women is the practice of foot binding. This applies especially to women of the privileged classes. It's a way to really warp the foot of the little girl child, just fold it onto itself, bind it so that toes are all broken, and when the girl grows up, her feet she cannot really stand on her balls, but she really has to drag her feet. Okay? That's a practice of foot binding that is used to control women of higher rank. So in a way, if you're a woman of a lower rank, you have to work, and so they don't bind your foot. But if you happen to be a woman of a little more preferable rank, then they bind your foot and you can't walk. So there is really no way to win if you're a girl in China at this time. There are new American crops that are imported into the diet of the Chinese population, and so there is a growth in the population. In 1500, the population is estimated at about 100 million, and in 1600s, in the year 1600, it's already at 160 millions. We take a quick look at the social classes of China. There are the privileged classes, the gentry, and the scholar bureaucrats. The women of these classes are the ones with the foot binding. And then there is the working class, which includes the peasants and the artisans. We can see some of the ideas that don't really encourage much change, even in the social order, because merchants, for example, are not only considered part of the working class, but they're also considered parasites, because the understanding is that they only trade, they don't really do things, and so they're considered a parasitic class. And then there are those who are seen as mean people. Mean people include slaves, servants, entertainers, and prostitutes. So all of these people and these jobs are degraded, really. The people are perceived, are understood, are interpreted as actually mean just because they do these jobs. And we have to say that this social order encouraged stability rather than change. Then we take a very brief look also to Japan. So Japan becomes unified during this period under the shogun. The shogun is a military authority. So we can understand that as a country, as a nation, it becomes unified under a military authority, and is likely to be a sort of militaristic and authoritarian type of government. On the other hand, in contrast to the military enclaves, we observe the urban cultures that were more dedicated to pleasure. In fact, those were known as the floating world. So we have poets, for example, who write about the life of a man who lived for love. We have the development of the famous kabuki theater. In terms of religion, what prevails in Japan is Buddhism, that comes from China, then Confucianism, which is really more of a philosophy, and also Shintoism, which emphasizes purity. And we have to remember that in Japan at this time, the educated classes learn Chinese. It's a sort of recognition of a certain cultural indebtedness of Japan's culture to Chinese culture. So if you are an erudite in Japan, you learn Chinese in the same way that, say, people in Europe used to learn Latin. Yes, we are now focusing on the 6th chapter of this part 5 of the 2nd volume of Traditions and Encounters. This chapter is dedicated to the Islamic empires. So we are going to focus on the Middle East, the original region of Islam, and also the neighboring areas that have become dominated by Islam, that extend from Greece actually to North India during this period of global interdependence. And in order to focus better on the political aspects, we will focus on the political aspects and then some of the social aspects and how all these things evolve. So we are going to take a look at map 1, where we see the 3 Islamic empires. In other words, the whole of Islam has become configured as 3 separate empires. Most to the west is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks are now dominating the whole area that used to be Byzantium. So, and they have expanded to all of North Africa and Greece. So it's a rather powerful empire. And then in the center, with a sort of center in the country that today is called Iran, in that area, and was once called Persia, we have the Safavid Empire. And then we see that most of the Indian subcontinent is also dominated by Islam, and that's the Mughal Empire. We're going to take a brief look at these 3 empires. Okay, the Ottoman Empire is very expansive. It occupies an area that is even wider than the Eastern Roman Empire, or the former Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, and it engages in fights with Venice, for example. Suleiman the Magnificent, in fact, even wanted to capture the Pope in Rome. So we see that it's a rather aggressive empire, and it's an empire that really wants to expand and aggress. In fact, in our course, we focus on Veronica Franco, who was a courtesan in Venice that saved Venice from the Turks by sleeping with the King of France. So we see that she had a good reason to help her fellow citizens of Venice, because the Turks were very aggressive. So the Ottoman Empire is a Sunni empire, and we have to remember that within Islam, the Sunnis are the ones who consider themselves the spiritual descendants of Muhammad. Okay. The Safavid Empire, with center in the region of Persia, is a more stable empire. And this is an empire that considered itself Shia. Okay, Shia as opposed to Sunni, these terms are still very important in Islam. The Shia people of Islam are those who follow the cousin of Muhammad. So there is a kinship link that they can claim, whereas the Sunni are the spiritual descendants. Okay. It is important to understand that Islam is a dominant religion, and it's also a mode of government, but that these societies are very ancient and therefore are quite layered. What appears to be a complete domination of Islam often simply hides other cultures that have become a bit hidden, that are still present but in a hidden form. And so, for example, in our reading of Montesquieu or from the book The Persian Letters, we learn about the Gabar. The Gabar were Zoroastrians who actually lived in Persia under Islam, so they had to camouflage themselves as Muslims, but they were actually Gabar, and this occurred throughout these empires. Then we have the Mughal Empire in North India. A very charismatic leader in this empire was Akbar, that brought Islam to the Hindu lands. We have to understand also that Islam had been for a very long time a vehicle of expansion of culture, especially in the Middle Ages when Europe was a bit dormant. It was Islam that really was the conduit of cultural transmission of cultural understandings and texts. So it still is a world that has traditions of trades and merchants, a tradition of religious tolerance and acceptance of diversity, and patronage of the arts and of culture. This is the period when the famous Taj Mahal is built in India. It is a dynastic state, and eventually it begins to decline, partly because it is not very capable of transforming. We are now coming to part 6 of volume 2 of the book Traditions and Encounters. And we want to introduce this new part, this new section of the book. This section will focus on an age of revolution, industry, and empire. And the dates we are talking about begin with the middle of the 18th century, 1750, and then we end in the second decade of the 20th century, 1914. So this part of the book focuses on what may be called an expanded 19th century. The 19th century extended to include the second half of the 18th century, which corresponds to the age of revolution in the Atlantic world, and then the 19th century proper, and the initial years of the 20th century that led up to the outbreak, to the explosion of World War I in 1914. It is an age of rapid transformation and intense with events. The European-based cultural transformation movements of the age include the two parallel movements known as the Enlightenment and Libertinism, which developed alongside the 18th century, the Enlightenment being more of an intellectual movement for social reform, and libertinism more of a kind of behavioral movement of people who could afford and wanted to really take the freedom or the liberty of all kinds of expressions, including amorous expression, in that time, a very rigid and artificial time. Then there is the brief and very intense movement of Romanticism. This goes alongside the revolutionary period at the turn of the 18th century. Eventually, in the 19th century, we have other cultural movements, including realism and naturalism. A more realistic look at what are the results of these big revolutions. And also a preoccupation with human nature and how it can be degraded by the effects of industrialism. During this period, the extent of the hegemony of European people expanded to a more global scale. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, European powers controlled affairs in most of Asia and Africa, and their Euro-American cousins dominated the Americas. There are three factors in this way that the world evolved: revolution, industrialization, and empire. So the most intense period of revolution is the late 18th and early 19th century. We have a revolution in North America, a revolution in France, and a revolution in Haiti, the most radical of all these four. And then independence movements of the colonies of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies of Central and South America. How do these revolutions come to be? Clearly, the action of these revolutions embodies the values of the Enlightenment, including freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty. Obviously, the results of each revolution were different, and so the results varied. For example, in Haiti, the revolution abolished slavery, but in the United States, it didn't. And in fact, that whole chapter was delayed for almost another century until we get to the Civil War. In Europe, in France, eventually the monarchy was abolished, and whereas in Italy, for example, a new state was founded based on a constitutional monarchy. Overall, we see in this period the formation of national identities. To really understand what a national identity is, perhaps from our location here in Puerto Rico, we can look at the kind of thinking that comes to us from the independentistas, right? Independentistas are those who emphasize a national identity for our island of Puerto Rico. Second factor, industrialization. What is industrialization? It's a change in the mode of production from manual to mechanical, okay? Via steel machines powered by coal, and later on by oil or petrol. This caused a whole lot of changes. The use of these machines caused a lot of changes in people's lives, including discomfort and from dislocation of workers who used to live in the country and now have to move to the city or near the factory where they work. Eventually, we can say that it created stronger and more powerful societies. And also, this mode of production required the importation of agricultural products. And those came from plantation economies in the colonies. So just to give a very simple example, let's look at cotton. Okay? Cotton is often used to manufacture into clothes, like my clothes or this fabric made of cotton. What happens to what is the whole itinerary of cotton? Cotton is produced in the colonies, for example, the colonies that Great Britain had in the southern area of the United States, what eventually became the Confederate States. So there were cotton plantations there. So the cotton is produced there, then is imported into England, and then there is a factory or a place, a factory where this cotton is manufactured, not by hand, but actually with these textile machines. So industrialization started in England, but then it expanded to Western Europe, impacting particularly the area we know as Germany, France, and then northern Italy. The third factor is imperialism. We know that industrial capitalism needs colonies. Who is going to grow all the cotton needed in the textile industry? The way to make sure you have colonies is to evolve an empire. So that's where imperialism comes from. What are the tools of empire at this time? Some of them are very good tools, like the construction of railroads in the colonies, the use of steamships activated by coal, the installation of the telegraph as a means of communication. Other tools are less pleasant, like lethal weapons. And of course, everything revolves and is organized around the industrial technologies that allow this industrial type of production. So at this point, in the middle of the 19th century, we can say that the European powers imposed their rule in most of Asia and Africa. They dominate and marginalize the indigenous people of the Americas. They exploit paid laborers, often in the form of immigrants from countries who have excess population and don't have their own colonies. And they exploit unpaid laborers, namely the slaves. So in a way, industrial production is a three-pronged system of domination that encountered sustained resistance. We need to imagine that there was resistance to the implementation of this system all the time. All the time this resistance was present. Resistance from whom? From colonized people of Asia and Africa, from the enslaved people of the Americas, especially African Americans, and from exploited people, the workers, the industrial workers that powered the factories. Okay, so this is what we are going to look at in the subsequent chapters.